So my mom was sharing with me this week a story that her morning walking buddy, Chris, had shared with her. And Chris's granddaughter was asking her parents this past week what Easter was all about. She's getting to that age where those questions are starting to surface for her. And they, for I'm sure a lot of different reasons, are not involved in any faith community. So it seems reasonable that their daughter would start to ask those questions of what all this Easter business is about. And they shared with her their understanding of Jesus' death and being placed in a tomb and coming back to life and then walking out of the tomb. And their daughter, who is probably around 7, was trying to make sense of the story with what she just understood in the world and innocently asked them, does that mean Jesus is like a zombie? And so her parents laughed, and she kind of felt that wave of embarrassment come over her by the question that she had asked. And I would guess that most of us have felt after we've asked a question or tried to make sense of something, we've kind of felt that wave of embarrassment come over us. And I've thought about this story a lot this week, because I think most of us can relate to that experience of trying to understand something, trying to make sense of something that we are seeking, but feel too embarrassed to ask for help, or feel embarrassed when we do and the answer comes with an air of shame, whether intended or just perceived. And I don't know exactly what this young girl was trying to sort through, but what I do know is that we can have fun and enjoy all the festivities of all the holidays, but we can also recognize that we need something deeper to lean into and to help give us some guidance in this life. I think all of us at one point will encounter that dark night of that heart-wrenching grief, devastating disappointment, or smothering shame. And when we do, even though I love Reese's peanut butter cups and can probably eat my own weight in Peeps and Bunnies, I need more than these colorful treats to help guide me. And I wonder when that need for more will happen for this young girl, or for any of us. Will it be when she is bullied at school and feels like there's no one to turn to? Will it be when she's been betrayed by a friend or has her heart broken by her first love? Or perhaps it's the day we look in the mirror and admit to ourselves that it was us who was the bully or betrayer or heartbreaker and don't know what to do with ourselves in that oversensing sense of guilt and shame. Maybe it will be the moment when we witness people who seem to have that thing about them, that peace and serenity that we haven't seemed to be able to find. Maybe it'll be the day when we get a call from the doctor and our heart drops. Or the day a job ends with a pink slip and a time limit on when to get your office cleaned out. Or maybe it's the times where we feel like we don't belong because of racism, gender, classism, or some other kind of ism. And maybe it's the moment when you realize that you are powerless over drugs and alcohol and that life is unmanageable. And what you need is more than bunnies and jelly beans and Peeps. You and I know, perhaps all too well, because of where we are sitting this morning, that those days do happen. And as Mary Chapin Carpenter's lyrics described, it seems so black outside that you can't remember that light ever shone on you or the ones you love in this or another lifetime. And that's why we really need days like Easter and need to know what Easter is about. And that might have been how Mary Magdalene felt that first Easter morning. It was just so dark outside. Violence and fear hung like a dark cloud over her once adventurous life, following and learning from this peaceful and dynamic and authoritative teacher around whom she had reoriented her entire life. The light that had once shone on her life had just been extinguished by a Roman cross. And not only was it dark in the world, but it was also dark in her soul. Where there had once been a glimmer of hope, there was now only despair. And while it was still dark, she came to the tomb. And there in the darkness of her life, she was surprised by the light of Easter. And her story has become the story that we celebrate on this day. It is the story that we remember and celebrate today, because it is a story of hope, which we cling to, and the promise upon which we can stand. And so what is it all about? It's about life. I was reading a commentary by Pam Driesel, and she wrote that scientists have studied the mineral and chemical composition of the human body, that the U.S. Bureau of Chemistry and Soils has calculated the chemical and mineral composition of the human body. We are 65% oxygen, 18% carbon, 10% hydrogen, 3% nitrogen, 1.5% calcium, 1% phosphorus, and a whole bunch of other minerals and chemicals. And so she writes that if we took all those parts and sold them on the common market, it would probably be less than $1. And it's actually our skin that's our most valuable physical asset. It's worth about $3.50. So add it all up, and we are worth a little under $5. But I'm going to ask you now, take a moment and place your hand either on your wrist or by your windpipe. And let's just be quiet and still for a moment together. And what do you feel? You can feel your pulse. You feel the mystery of the biological life beating through your less than $5 worth of chemicals and minerals. But we are so much more than $5 worth of elements. And Easter, this day that we are celebrating, is about the power of life and the power that makes that $5 worth of elements priceless. Easter is about recognizing that there is a power greater than ourselves, and there is a power greater than addiction that gives us life. Easter reassures us that when we have abundant life, and that it is available to all of us here and now. And that is what the resurrection is all about. Because we all know that having a pulse does not guarantee a full and abundant life. We can have a biological life, exist, but not really live. Or we can have the energy of God and the spirit of life and experience abundant life. One can have a heartbeat but no heart for living, and an existence but no energy. But all of us are worth more than that mere $5. You are worth more, far more than the sum of your biological parts. And that more is what Easter and the resurrection and recovery is all about. Easter addresses the universal human longing to tap into that more. You might call it meaning, you might call it peace, you might call it purpose. St. Augustine called it that longing for God, that restlessness that only finds rest in God. Paul Tillich called it the ground or power of being itself. And Kierkegaard called it the leap of faith that quells anxiety. And this program of recovery addresses it in steps 2 and 3, coming to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity, and that we can turn to that power to guide and direct our lives. So part of my Holy Week tradition since I've been at Cumberland Heights is attending the Passover Seder with the Jacks community. And Passover is full of ritual symbols that retell the Exodus story. And many of these symbols are displayed on the Seder plate, which is the centerpiece of the table. And they include a vegetable, a shank bone, a mixture of apples, nuts, and spices, bitter herbs. And this year, there was an orange on the plate. And the rabbi explained that the orange symbolized those who have been told that they don't belong. And this was such a powerful image for me, because it brought me back to the story of that little girl wanting to understand what Easter is all about and feeling embarrassed. It brought me back to my own story of being told, fortunately not very often, that as a woman I don't belong in ministry. And it makes me wonder about your story. When have you been told that you don't belong? How has your addiction tried to convince you that you don't belong? This cunning, powerful, and baffling disease tries to convince people that they don't belong in the light of life. But I know that the Easter story and God's love for us is stronger than addiction. And I truly believe that God's love is stronger than anything addiction can bring. All of us are seeking God's love and God's presence in our lives in one way or another. We want to know the more of life, that peace and serenity and ground of being. We want to understand how to have life that is abundant and not just a pulse. We want to know God however we understand God and whatever we end up calling that divine energy. Easter is certainly the Christian understanding to that longing, but I think all of us can glean meaning from the Easter story of promise and hope and resurrection. Easter is knowing that death is not the end, and a pulse alone is not living. But if you aren't sure exactly what that means, and if you feel in the dark about it, you're in good company. Mary came to the tomb thinking death was the end. And she goes into the dark to prepare Jesus' $5 worth of minerals and chemicals for burial. And she is grieving. And at first she does not even recognize the new life right when it is in front of her. But when Jesus speaks her name, she knows. And maybe you can relate to Mary. Maybe you are resigned to the futility of life and the awful pain of addiction that feels like death. Or maybe you're experiencing grief in ways so raw that you can't see much life. And maybe even one or more of these things has convinced you that not much makes sense in this life. And although you are breathing and your heart is beating, it's breaking and life feels empty. Mary shares her experience with others. But here's an important part of the story for us to remember. That even when she shares her story with others, the ones who come to the tomb don't automatically see Jesus or get any proof of what Mary has shared with them. They just go back home and continue to hang out together, share their experiences until one day when he appears to them in the midst of their own dark night. And when he does appear to them, he shows them his scars and wounds, and he shows them the evidence of the lowest point of his human life, when he was defeated and overcome and beaten down. But it was not the end of his story. And this is also our story. Addiction takes people to the lowest points of their life. They can feel defeated and overcome and beaten down, but it is not the end of the story. When Jesus shows up and wants the disciples to feel his wounds, he is saying, I am scarred and wounded, but these wounds will not keep the energy and life of God from flowing through me to you. And this is all of our story. Addiction may leave you wounded and scarred, but those wounds will not keep the energy and love and life of God from flowing through you. And it flows through each and every single person sitting in this room this morning and those who are beyond these walls. Easter is not a promise that life will be like it used to be. It is a promise that the power that gave you the pulse of life will never abandon you. That power that raised Jesus from the dead can raise you from despair. And that same power is calling you by name and is at work doing new things in each and every one of us. Easter is the promise that nothing in your past or present or future has the ultimate power to define you. You are defined by the light of God that flows through you and flows through all of creation, making all things new. Steve Mills, a former co-worker of ours here, wrote a song about recovery called Resurrection Sunday. And just a few lines that I pulled from his song are as it's Resurrection Sunday, and fellow travelers are going to share the load. So rise up and walk again for just one day, and let the power bring you back to life. Find it deep inside whenever you need it. Crucified by your vicious disease, rise up and recover. Expect a miracle. You are a miracle, my friend. So So I'm going to ask you to put your hand on your pulse again. You don't have to prove love to embrace it. You don't have to prove life. You live it. And you don't have to prove new life because you receive it. The way of life is calling us, the way of resurrection. So just as surely as blood is pulsing through your veins right now, the pulse of God is pulsing through creation, making all things new. We are called by name to receive that new life and to share it with the world. Amen.